Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. The roar of the engine still makes my heart race. Bob Harris, a former U.S. Navy pilot, and the skies over the Yellow Sea during the Korean War became my second home. The adrenaline of those air battles still runs through my veins when I think back to those days. I was an F-4U Corsair pilot, a robust aircraft that had become my second home. Our base was on the USS Princeton, an aircraft carrier that tirelessly patrolled the territorial waters near the Korean peninsula. Our main mission was to intercept the formations of Soviet MiG-15s that constantly threatened our positions. Our squadron, the VF-113, known as the Stingers, had a reputation to live up to. We were considered one of the most efficient units in the Pacific Fleet, with several aces among our pilots. Commander Frank Morrison, our squadron leader, was a World War II veteran who trained us incessantly in air combat tactics. I particularly remember one morning when the briefing was more tense than usual. Our intelligence services had detected a significant increase in enemy air activity. The Soviets were getting bolder, moving ever closer to our naval positions. "We need to show presence," said Morrison during the briefing. "The Russians are testing our limits, and we can't take a step back." His words carried the weight of the experience and responsibility we all shared. My wingman was Joe Martinez, a young man from San Diego with impressive reflexes and an enviable calmness under pressure. We formed an efficient duo, with more than 50 missions together. Mutual trust was essential when flying in combat formation. On that particular morning, we took off on a routine patrol. The deck of the aircraft carrier was damp from the morning dew, and the ground technicians were working with methodical precision, preparing our aircraft. The pre-flight ritual was always the same. Check the instruments, test the controls, check the weapon systems. Taking off from an aircraft carrier is a unique experience. The steam catapult launches the aircraft from 0 to 140 knots in a matter of seconds. The impact of the acceleration presses you against the seat with brutal force, but it's a sensation that every naval pilot learns to appreciate. Our formation of 4 Corsairs gained altitude quickly, establishing a patrol pattern at 20,000 feet. The radio remained silent, except for routine checks. The tension was palpable. We all knew that the MiGs could appear at any moment. That's when the Princeton radar controller broke the silence. Stinger lead, multiple contacts approaching northern sector, altitude 25,000 feet, speed 500 knots. Morrison replied calmly, "Roger that, control." Stinger's combat formation now. The MiGs were technologically superior in several respects. They were faster and could fly higher than our Corsairs. Our advantage lay in experience and training. We knew we had to force them down to our altitude, where the Corsair had better maneuverability. Martinez kept a firm grip on my wing as we climbed to intercept the contacts. The sun was at our backs, a tactical advantage that Morrison wisely exploited. "Keep your eyes open," his voice sounded over the radio. "They usually work in pairs." That's when we spotted them, 6 MiG-15s cutting through the sky like silver arrows. Their formation was impeccable, demonstrating the high level of training of the Soviet pilots. The ensuing combat would be one of the most intense I've ever experienced. "Stingers, clear for combat," ordered Morrison. The battle was about to begin, and each pilot knew exactly what to do. Years of training and experience had prepared us for this moment. The weight of responsibility and the adrenaline of imminent combat blended into a familiar sensation for all of us. The next few minutes would be crucial. Decisions made in fractions of a second would determine who would return home and who would not. It was the stark reality of air combat, where there was no room for hesitation or error. The Korean War was about to show its most brutal face once again in the skies over the Yellow Sea. In a matter of seconds, the tranquil sky was transformed into a battlefield. The MiGs descended towards us with impressive speed, but our formation held firm. Morrison led our squadron in an intersection maneuver that we had practiced exhaustively during training. "Harris, Martinez, break east. Stay together." Morrison's voice sounded clear in my headphones. I pulled on the Corsair's controls, feeling the familiar G pressure as the aircraft responded to my commands. Martinez followed perfectly, his shadow constant on my right wing. The first encounter was brutal. Tracers sliced through the air as the MiGs passed through our formation. The roar of the engines and the boom of the guns blended into a chaotic symphony of combat. My heart was pounding, but my hands remained firm on the controls, the result of countless hours of training. "Contact at your 6 o'clock, Bob," Martinez warned. I immediately began a series of evasive maneuvers, diving and rolling the Corsair. The MiG that was chasing me was piloted by someone skilled, but he made the mistake of trying to keep up with me in a sharp turn. The Corsair might not have been as fast, but its maneuverability was exceptional at low altitudes. The battle developed at different altitude levels, with pairs of aircraft engaged in their own deadly duels. I saw Morrison lead his pursuer into a trap, using the defensive scissors technique he emphasized so much in training. The MiG, unable to follow the maneuver, went straight through, making a perfect target. "Stinger lead, kill confirmed," announced Princeton Control after Morrison hit his opponent. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 MiGs were still at our altitude, and another 2 remained higher up, looking for an opportunity to dive. Martinez and I stuck together, protecting each other. "Bob, let's try the maneuver we practiced last week," he suggested. I immediately understood what he was proposing. It was risky, but it could work. We began a coordinated series of maneuvers, appearing to separate us, but actually drawing the MiGs into a vulnerable position. The plan worked perfectly. One of the MiGs, focused on chasing me, didn't notice Martinez positioning himself for an attack. "Now, Joe!" I shouted. Martinez appeared almost out of nowhere, his machine guns thundering. The MiG was hit several times, starting to release black smoke before plunging towards a sea. The battle continued for several minutes that seemed like hours. Fuel was becoming critical and ammunition was running out. Morrison realized the situation. "Stingers, regroup. We're going home." It was the right time to end the fight. We had accomplished our mission, protecting the airspace and demonstrating our combat capabilities. On the way back, I stayed alert. Many pilots have been lost just when they thought the danger had passed. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange tones that contrasted strangely with the tension we still felt. "Nice maneuver back there, you two," Morrison praised over the radio. Martinez replied with a brief thank you, but I knew he was smiling in his cockpit. We had done well, very well in fact. Our coordination had been perfect, the result of months of flying together and trusting each other. As we approached Princeton, I began the landing procedures. Landing on an aircraft carrier is always a challenge, even more so after intense combat, when the adrenaline is still flowing and fatigue is beginning to take its toll. The runway seemed impossibly small down there, moving with the sway of the ship. "Stinger 2, you're cleared for landing." The landing controller's voice sounded calm and professional. I aligned the Corsair with the deck, maintaining the correct speed and altitude. The arresting hook came down, and I concentrated fully on the approach. The impact of the landing and the sudden deceleration as the hook caught the cable were almost a relief. We were finally home. As the mechanics approached our aircraft, I exchanged a glance with Martinez. We didn't need words to express how we felt. We had faced death together once again and survived to tell the tale. It was another day in the life of a fighter pilot during the Korean War, another page in our personal history of combat in the Pacific skies. The debriefing awaited us, after which we had to prepare for the next mission. The war didn't wait, and the skies over the Yellow Sea would continue to be our combat arena for a long time to come. The debriefing after that intense combat was longer than usual. Morrison wanted every detail documented, every maneuver analyzed. As we recounted our experiences in the briefing room at Princeton, I realized that clash had changed something in all of us. The reality of the war was becoming increasingly clear. The Soviets are adapting their tactics, I observed during the meeting. They're using more aggressive formations, trying to force us into disadvantageous situations. Martinez agreed, adding his own observations about how the enemy pilots seemed more determined than before. After the debriefing, we headed to the ship's mess hall. The smell of strong coffee and scrambled eggs filled the air, but few of us really had an appetite. The adrenaline of combat was still coursing through our veins, and the images of the battle remained vivid in our minds. It was during that breakfast that we received the news. Our next mission would be even more challenging. Intelligence had detected an advanced MiG base near the North Korean coast. Our task would be to carry out a preemptive strike, neutralizing the threat before it could become a bigger problem. Morrison reconvened a squadron for detailed planning. "This mission will be different," he explained, pointing to the tactical map. "We'll have to penetrate deep into hostile territory with little reserve fuel for combat." The tension was palpable in the room. We all knew the risks involved in operating so far from our base. The Corsair, for all its qualities, had a limited radius of action. Every drop of fuel would be precious. "Harris, you and Martinez lead the second element," Morrison ordered. "I want you to cover our rear during the approach." The responsibility weighed heavily on my shoulders, but I was prepared. Months of combat had made me a different pilot from the one who had arrived in Korea. The night before the mission, I couldn't sleep properly. I stayed on the flight deck, watching the stars and the dark sea below. The aircraft carrier seemed surprisingly quiet. Only the constant sound of machinery and the occasional creak of metal breaking the silence. Martinez found me there. "Can't sleep either, Bob?" He joined me, leaning back against the railing. We talked about home, about the future, about everything except the mission ahead of us. It was our way of dealing with the pressure. Dawn came too quickly. The final briefing was concise and to the point. Morrison reminded us of the critical points of the mission: maintain tight formation, save fuel, and above all, stay alert for enemy intercepts. The deck was damp as we began takeoff procedures. The mechanics worked in silence, their precise movements demonstrating years of experience. Each pilot did his own pre-flight check, a ritual that could mean the difference between life and death. "Stingers, prepare for takeoff," the controller's voice sounded in our headsets. One by one, the Corsairs were launched into the still dark morning air. The formation set up quickly, and we began our journey towards enemy territory. The rising sun was just beginning to light up the horizon as we crossed the line demarcating the hostile airspace. The radio remained silent, except for the essential checks. Each pilot was concentrating on his part of the mission, aware that any mistake could jeopardize the entire group. Contacts on radar announced the Princeton's controller. Multiple bogies approaching from the northeast sector. It was the moment we had been dreading. The MiGs had detected us earlier than we had expected. Morrison had to make a crucial decision: continue with the original mission or engage the interceptors. Fuel was a constant concern, and every minute of combat would mean less autonomy for the return. "Stingers, hold your course," he ordered after a moment's consideration. "If they want to fight, we'll give it to them, but on our terms." It was a risky decision, but we trusted our leader's judgment. The next few minutes would be decisive. Our formation held firm, while the dots on the radar were fast approaching. The coming battle promised to be even more intense than the previous one, and this time we would be operating at the limits of our autonomy. Combat was imminent, and each pilot was preparing in his own way. I adjusted my seatbelt, checked the instruments again, and exchanged a brief glance with Martinez. We didn't need words to communicate our determination. The next chapter of this story was about to be written in the skies over Korea. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in the skies over Korea. With limited fuel and deep in enemy territory, every decision had to be perfect. The MiGs appeared like silver ghosts against the rising sun, a sight that still lingers in my memory. Visual contact, 12 high. Martinez's voice sounded tense over the radio. Our opponents had opted for a classic tactic, using the advantage of altitude and the sun at their backs. But we were prepared. Morrison immediately ordered a coordinated dispersal maneuver that we had practiced countless times. My Corsair responded instantly to the commands as I pulled the control column, initiating an upward spin. The G-force pressed my body against the seat as I executed the maneuver. Martinez remained faithfully on my wing. Our coordination was like a deadly dance in the skies. "Harris, two bad guys splitting up for your position?" Morrison warned. I quickly assessed my options, aware that every second of combat consumed precious fuel. I opted for a risky maneuver, diving abruptly to gain speed and force the MiGs into a disadvantageous situation. The fight turned into a series of individual duels. Our formation split into two plane elements, each pair fighting its own battle. The sky was filled with the roar of engines and the occasional glint of tracers slicing through the air. It was a lethal ballet at 20,000 feet. My ammunition was half gone when I spotted an opportunity. One of the MiGs had made the mistake of trying to keep up with me in a sharp turn. The Corsair might not be faster, but its maneuverability was unmatched in these situations. I turned the plane brutally, feeling the controls vibrate under the stress of the maneuver. "Now, Bob," Martinez shouted, understanding my intention. In a split second, the MiG filled my sights. I pressed the trigger, sending a precise burst. I saw fragments detach themselves from the enemy fuselage before it plunged into a downward spiral. But there was no time to celebrate. Fuel was reaching critical levels, and we still had to complete our original mission. Morrison made the decision we knew was necessary. Stingers, stay on course for the primary objective. Save ammunition and fuel. The enemy base appeared on the horizon exactly as the intelligence reports had described. It was a well-defended complex with anti-aircraft defenses that soon began to fill the sky with black explosions. We kept our formation close. Each pilot focused on a specific role in the attack. "Start bombing run," Morrison ordered. Our Corsairs, carrying bombs in addition to their normal weapons, began their deadly approach. Time seemed to slow down as we concentrated on the precision required for this type of attack. The explosions at the enemy installations confirmed the success of our mission, but the price was high. Fuel was dangerously low, and we still had a long journey back. To complicate matters, the Princeton's radars detected more MiGs approaching our position. "Stingers, standard escape route Delta," Morrison commanded. It was our only chance. We needed to use what little altitude we had left to gain speed and distance. Every pilot knew that we were operating on the edge of the impossible. The return flight was an exercise in precision and nerves of steel. We maintained a tight formation to save energy, while Morrison mentally calculated our chances of reaching the carrier. The radio silence was broken only by brief status checks. I saw the fuel gauge hit reserve when the Princeton finally appeared on the horizon. Never had the sight of an aircraft carrier seemed so welcome. However, we still had to make perfect landings. There was no fuel for a second attempt. "Stinger 2, you are cleared for approach," the landing controller announced. I aligned the Corsair with the deck, aware that every movement had to be precise. Landing in those conditions required all the skill we had developed over months of operations. After returning from that almost impossible mission, the reality of war began to weigh even more heavily on us. The fuel in my Corsair had literally run out when the wheels touched the deck of the Princeton. Several other pilots reported a similar situation. We had reached the extreme limit of our capabilities and survived to tell the tale. During the debriefing, Morrison was more serious than usual. "Gentlemen, today we demonstrated what it means to be a naval pilot, but we also learned a valuable lesson about the limits of men and machines." His words carried the weight of experience and responsibility. That night, as I tried to rest in my bunk, I couldn't stop thinking about how circumstances had changed. At the start of the war, we were young pilots full of bravado and confidence. Now, every mission was a calculated exercise in survival and efficiency. "Bob, are you awake?" Martinez whispered from the next bunk. "I can't sleep thinking about that last MiG we shot down. That was close." He was right. Our ammunition was almost gone, and that last confrontation could easily have ended differently. The next morning brought new orders. Intelligence had detected a pattern in enemy operations. The Soviets were using advanced bases to refuel their MiGs, allowing them to operate longer in our area. Our next mission would be to identify and, if possible, neutralize these support points. "This will be a different operation," Morrison explained during the briefing. "We will need to fly low, avoiding radar detection. Each plane will carry cameras in addition to the standard weaponry." It was a reconnaissance mission that could easily turn into combat. The tension in the group was palpable. Flying low over enemy territory meant exposure to anti-aircraft artillery, as well as the constant risk of interception. But we understood the strategic importance of the mission. Every piece of information we collected could save lives in the future. We took off before dawn, our formation of 6 Corsairs remaining just a few hundred feet above the waves. The noise of the engine seemed even more intense at that altitude, echoing over the surface of the sea. Martinez remained on my wing, his constant presence a source of comfort in the darkness. Crossing demarcation line now, Morrison announced. Instinctively, we all checked our instruments once more. Flying so low required total concentration, a moment's distraction, an error of judgment, and we could be crashing into the water before we even realized what had happened. The sun was just beginning to rise when we spotted the first suspicious area. It was a small peninsula with what looked like a makeshift airstrip. "Start a photo sequence," Morrison ordered. The cameras began to record every detail of the terrain below. It was then that all hell broke loose. Tracers began to rise from the coast, and the radar alert informed us of MiGs taking off from somewhere nearby. We were stuck between continuing the reconnaissance mission or preparing for the inevitable combat. "Stay on course," Morrison commanded firmly. "Complete the photographic sequence." Harris, Martinez, prepare for defensive cover. It was a risky decision, but we trusted our leader. The information we were gathering was too vital to abandon the mission. The next few minutes were a test of nerves and skill. We kept our altitude low, the cameras continuing their work as we fended off attacks. The Corsair once again proved its versatility, allowing defensive maneuvers while maintaining the stability needed for photographs. "Bogey, 6 o'clock hot," Martinez's voice cut through the air. 2 MiGs were diving towards us, taking advantage of the altitude. It was the moment we had been dreading. We had to choose between keeping our cover low or climbing to meet the threat. Morrison made the decision for us. Stinger 2 and 3 move up and engage. Rest of formation, maintain mission. It was our chance to protect the operation while completing vital reconnaissance. I pulled on the controls, feeling the Corsair respond with its characteristic fidelity. Martinez accompanied me perfectly as we gained altitude to face the interceptors. The combat that followed was a deadly dance of machines and men, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. The MiGs we faced that morning were different. Their pilots displayed a calculated aggressiveness that only comes with a lot of experience. Martinez and I found ourselves in one of the most challenging situations of our careers, trying to protect our squadron while they completed the crucial reconnaissance mission. "Bob, we need to keep them busy for another 3 minutes," Martinez shouted over the radio as he executed a perfect evasive maneuver. Our Corsairs danced across the sky in a deadly choreography with the Soviet fighters, each move precisely calculated to keep the enemy away from our main force. Ammunition was becoming critical. My indicators showed less than 100 shells remaining when I spotted an opportunity. One of the MiGs had exposed itself during a very wide turn, trying to position itself behind Martinez. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. "Joe, brake right now?" I ordered, already pulling the controls for the intercept. The MiG realized my approach too late. A single precise blast was enough. I saw fragments detach from its fuselage before it began an uncontrolled dive towards the sea. Morrison beamed to confirm that they had completed the photographic sequence. It was time to go home, but the fight wasn't over yet. The last MiG, instead of withdrawing, decided to make one last desperate assault on our main formation. With only a few bursts left in my guns, I had to make a split-second decision. I pushed the Corsair to its absolute limit, intercepting the MiG before it could reach its targets. The duel that followed was brief and intense. Every shot had to count. "Incredible, Bob," exclaimed Martinez when the last MiG finally withdrew, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. But there was no time to celebrate. Our mission had consumed far more fuel than planned, and the Princeton was a considerable distance away. The return flight was an exercise in precision and economy. Every move was calculated to conserve fuel, while maintaining constant vigilance against possible pursuers. The radio silence was broken only by brief status updates. When we finally spotted the aircraft carrier, My fuel gauge was dangerously close to zero. Morrison coordinated our approach with his characteristic efficiency, prioritizing the most critical planes for landing. Stinger 2, you're cleared for final approach, announced the landing controller. Never had a landing seemed so challenging. With the last drops of fuel, there was no margin for error. The deck of the Princeton seemed impossibly small below me. The touch was harder than usual, but the hook caught the arresting cable perfectly. When my Corsair finally stopped, the engine died. There was not a drop of fuel left in the tanks. Hours later, during the debriefing, the photographs revealed the true importance of our mission. We had discovered not just one, but 3 forward bases that the Soviets were using to extend the range of their MiGs. This information would significantly change the course of our operations. Morrison brought us together in private after the official debriefing. "You two saved the mission today," he said, looking at Martinez and me. "But more importantly, you saved lives. Those bases we discovered were being used to plan attacks against our ships." That mission marked a turning point in our private war in the skies over Korea. In the months that followed, we used the information gathered to systematically neutralize the enemy's ability to carry out prolonged operations in our sector. Years later, at veterans reunions, we still discuss that day. Martinez always jokes about how we got home flying on the last drops of fuel and prayers. But we all know it was more than luck. It was the result of intense training, teamwork, and the unwavering determination that characterized naval pilots. The Korean War may not have the historical spotlight of the Second World War, but for those of us who fought in it, every mission, every combat, and every safe return to the aircraft carrier is permanently etched in our memory. These were moments that defined not only our youth, but also the kind of men we became. Today, when young pilots ask me about those days, I always emphasize that the true measure of a combat pilot is not just in his victories, but in his ability to carry out the mission and bring his comrades home. It was a lesson I learned in the skies over the Yellow Sea, a lesson written not only in my mission reports, but also in the hearts of every pilot who served during that forgotten conflict.